Hello and welcome to episode 16 Militarization of Space Face the Reality. To understand this issue, we have today with us Harini Madhusudan. Hi, Harini. Welcome to the
Hel-
podcast.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Likewise, thank you very much for joining us. As we'll be taking a deep dive into this topic, so prior to that, can you please provide a brief overview of your career, the organization you're associated with, the ongoing research of yours, and in general, your journey in the space industry?
Sure, sir. My name is Harini Madhusudan. I'm a PhD scholar at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. My background is in international relations, political science, international relations, world history, and I developed an interest for space politics, space studies through my international relations journey. In my master's, I looked at militarization, weaponization, and outer space, and my interest grew further, and I took up my PhD in militarization of outer space. So most of my focus is on militarization of outer space, but I also look at the transition that the outer space domain is seeing these days. So you see the space race 2.0, or how we see space evolving as the technology gets more affordable, the tourism, Mars race, and all of it. And along with that, I have a small interest in international political economy, international law, and for area studies, I look at Russia. So this is broadly what I work on.
Interesting. I guess there is a need for individuals like you in the space industry because I have always met engineers who have turned into a businessman or turned full into the commercial space sector, but I have hardly seen any individual coming from the political science background and trying to make a huge difference in the space industry. Of course, there are quite a lot of individuals whose existing expertise are in the engineering sector, but then they later on in the later part of their career, they shifted to IR and diplomacy. But I believe there is more need of such individuals in the industry. So yeah, we wish you good luck with your research. And
All
so
right.
before we take a deep dive into this topic, can you tell us what is the meaning of militarization of space? The reason I'm asking this question is because we
Mm.
have quite a lot of audience from the commercial space sector,
Okay.
and I think the familiarization of term is there in the space industry, but not to the level at which the international relations people know it in a much more depth. So can you please tell us the meaning of this term?
Sure, sir. So I think we can look at militarization of outer space under three broad spectrums. One is the role of space capabilities in a country's defense applications. So you will have satellites giving support to the ground stations, the ground systems of a military strategy. So that would be the first part. Second part would be addressing security challenges in space itself. So that will be you have dedicated military satellites that are doing your surveillance, that are doing your intelligence gathering, and that are also probably equipped with this is again, it's a future idea that a satellite could be equipped with some form of a technology that is uh, counter um, counterbalancing or like a counter weapon to something that might attack your satellite, right? So that is your second broad theme. The third theme, it would be the role of defense forces in outer space itself. So when we see uh, an anti-satellite or a ground missile that could attack another satellite or attack another region. So this is your defense forces that is traveling through outer space, traveling through beyond the 100-meter line, and their role, what they play in outer space. And then there is this future plan of having a military base on the moon, or having capabilities or military observation capabilities through the lunar orbits and things like that. So all of these can be broadly looked at as a militarization concept, where you're investing on space technology or space capabilities with the idea of using it specifically for security and defense purposes.
All right. So I think It's pretty much safe to say that the terrestrial conflicts are finally or have started affecting the cooperation in space, because it's only the adversary movements that might possibly create a militarization of space. And
Yes.
so, in general, like, what are the key factors contributing to the militarization of space from your perspective?
So I think one of the primary contribution to militarization of outer space. So we know that during the Cold War, you had US and Russia having very active military engagement in outer space. So outer space essentially became they called it the final frontier of defense capabilities, right? So it was land, water, air, and then space became your final frontier. And the competition was intense to have the best technology, to have the best innovations that could reach farther away from our atmosphere. So now what has happened is the number of players in outer space have increased. You have countries from UAE to North Korea to anybody who has sufficient scientific knowledge and sufficient investment capabilities, they can reach outer space. So you have innovation and the loss of heavy costs. So it's cheaper now to go to space than it was 20 years ago. So I think these are the two factors. And the third factor is the increasing geopolitical conflict. You have I would want to observe my neighbors or observe somebody who might be potentially a threat from outer space at much cheaper than using human intelligence. So these things have become guiding factors for the increased militarization of outer space. So it is essentially the cost cutting and innovation that has driven this need to have a very strong military presence in outer space. And
I would say
I
this
could
is a
be wrong.
very I
Yeah,
would say this is a very interesting point, and I believe your point very much aligns with our previous episode guest who came on our podcast, uh, and she was telling us the same thing. Somewhere, the innovation and the commercialization is actually responsible to increase the threats in the space domain, because uh, we know that the more accessible you keep the technology, the more adversarial activities will start increasing. I mean,
um,
the day won't be far that we will be seeing an adversary or an extremist group operating a satellite company uh,
yeah,
under some or the other cover, possibly. And I think there should be some kind of regulation. That's one of the reason I feel, especially from as I come from India, and I believe the Indian space sector has a fairly much more government control over most of the space assets as compared to the the commercialization that is happening in Europe or United States. And
yeah,
one good thing about that is the national security is not at risk, at least to some extent. But yeah, we have seen, and there have been several incidents over here that the national security has been put into risk in a lot of incidents. There have been cases of espionage as well in Europe, in the European space industry, to put it in a broad perspective. So yeah,
yes, sir.
just to, I think, go a little more deeper into the topic, and I think we started with these questions previously also. So considering the regional conflict and the geopolitical dynamics, do you think space technology is becoming more of a strategic tool to navigate a state's international position as opposed to being just a peaceful resource?
Um, the shortest answer would be yes. And I think, so I'll go back to the point that you said that very soon we might see the reality that uh, some non-state actor would end up non-state as an very, very disruptive actor could have its own satellite. I would go far as to say that tomorrow you might see an individual who is probably very, very influential. He could have his own satellite and operate his systems because it's that cheap to own a satellite. And as coming back to the question that you said, using regional conflict and political dynamics, it is becoming more of a strategic tool, and it's becoming much more convenient to apply this strategic tool and get what you want. Because on one side, we see that the innovation and the costs are cheaper. On the other side, you see the regulation is very sparse. And today, if one of my satellites is observing a very, very um, how do I say this? A very strong location in my country that doesn't need to be surveilled, or you there is no way you know. And I remember reading this article where they said there are satellites that were capable of observing a bunker that is right in the middle of um, Iran's city. So we know the nuclear capabilities of Iran was under the city, right? So satellites were able to get data of that. So when we see that these regional and geopolitical conflicts, this is how it gets aggravated. So tomorrow, when Iran finds out that, oh my God, they were looking at my location, my geostrategic location, then I will also have to give an equal and opposite response to it. So I think in this way, there is an increase in mutual suspicion. There's also increase in like mistrust among countries. So you don't know uh, whom to trust, whom not to trust, why they're doing it, and all of it. And there's no way to know how much of our country they're observing, or how much of my strategic locations are being under their radar. So I think these are the things that really make it a very, very dicey situation to be in right now. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Is this something you've observed as well? I mean, in Europe, how is the case? Because you have ESA on one side that is collectively
Yes.
looking at outer space, but you also have individual space powers working in their own silos. So how does it work there?
Yeah, I believe the situation, I would say, it's kind of similar, where you cannot actually guarantee what a state or what an entity would do when they have
Yeah,
a full scale power, or at least to some extent, if they have some power in the space domain.
yeah,
Like for example, we in the recent times, I mean, like, I'm shifting little bit away from the topic that we're discussing,
yeah,
but yeah, collective information of narratives
yes,
is right now lacking a lot in the Western countries, I would say, because not, I would say not to that extent in France, because in France we still receive and can access the news from Iran, Russia. The news sources are still published very well over here. But if you go to other countries in the West, there's a problem. And this problem is actually, I would say, is in some way it is going to affect the research scholars, like, for example, research scholars like you who are right now, doing a deep research in some specific topics. The problem
yeah,
happening over here is such researchers are getting only one narrative, right?
yeah,
When they search anything about Russia, it's only CNN or CNBC popping up. There is no RT World, there is no other, possibly Iranian channel, Press TVR, IR. So those things are not actually, being consumed by the researchers. They just have one perspective. And I believe that's a very dangerous situation for an analyst, because as an analyst researcher, you need to consider each and every narrative and then come to one conclusion. But I think this is going to affect the future leadership positions. And I believe this might even later on affect the decision making in the military space domain, which ultimately will affect possibly the way adversary activities affect. And I think that is also the point where we would be able to see how some, or at least most of the developed countries in the West might start losing power, because the moment you have a leadership where that leader has consumed only one narrative, I believe the making power somewhere decreases to the level where it is not able to take a collective decision for the good of everyone, because that individual has only seen one perspective all his life. And I think that is happening right now at the moment, but we'll see its after effects after a few years. We
Yeah.
won't see it right now directly over here. It is an interesting thing. I mean, you mentioned and I connected with this thing because recently we had a guest from Romania, and his specialization is intelligence and security studies. So we had a topic dedicated on this thing is only, which was
Mm.
like espionage and narrative warfare, like
Yeah.
why it is necessary to have the narrative, and why it is also the responsibility of the common citizens to consume the narratives from both the sides and then come to a conclusion. And I think in the space industry, this is somewhere uh, a kind of a blockade, because the commercial space companies are highly bonded with the government agencies. I mean, their business at some point cannot run without the government's help.
Yeah.
And that's where the blockade is coming, that they are unable to take their own stand. They are unable to align with the narratives. For example, a lot of people possibly wanted to align with China or Russia on some projects, maybe for the purpose of commercial aspects, maybe for the purpose of innovation aspects as well. But unfortunately, they couldn't, because they are aligned or having contracts with some governments who are not aligning with the narratives of the East or possibly
Yeah.
Russia.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where the problem is. But yeah, I think we can definitely have a separate episode for sure on the narratives in the space industry, because I think this is a very important topic. And I'm glad
Yeah.
that you brought it up in bits and pieces in your previous answer.
Yes. So I
So
think
just
also, can I just, I mean, I wanted to add two more points. When it comes
yes,
to
yes,
adversary in space, I mean, adversary space capabilities, I think it's very different from how we look at adversaries on Earth. Because on Earth, there is some way of knowing how much of their capabilities are around. There is some way to know how much they are capable of um, influencing any sort of a damage on us. But in space, there's absolutely no way to know what is the extent of their investments, what is the extent of their capabilities, because it's not required to disclose how much they're investing in outer space. And I think that's one thing that would be, again, like I said, it's legally very sparsely addressed, but innovation wise it's grown beyond a lot of things. So I think that's one thing that would be very interesting to look at. um, that's
yes.
what I want to add. Yes, sir.
Definitely, definitely. I think there are a lot of perspectives and dynamics that can be possibly considered over here. And as I said, like definitely, I would be really happy, to have one more episode with you down the line, especially dedicated to this topic of, narratives in the space industry. And that narrative can be from any side. It's not only
Sure, sir. Sure.
commercial or defense, for sure. So yeah,
Yes, sir.
just to continue with this follow-up question on this,
Yeah.
because as I mentioned about narratives, and I think uh, this is in some way possibly very much important to shape the global supply chain or the business, because the
Yeah.
way you set your narrative is uh, decides the kind of business growth you will have as well. So from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the resilient supply chain initiative by India, Australia, and Japan? And will it affect the Swiss supply chain in Asia and Pacific region? So, firstly, I would say, because we have an audience from the space industry who are
Mm.
sometimes not familiar with several international security concepts.
Yeah.
So please start with an answer which will explain uh,
Mm.
what is resilient supply chain initiative firstly, and then you can take a deep dive actually.
So the resilient supply chain initiative is they want to keep a cycle that keeps a balanced and sustainable growth throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So basically, they want to look at they want to look at sharing of best practices between companies. They want to promote investments. They also want to match buyers and sellers uh, through common events for supply chain. Like they want to diversify the supply chains. So basically, you will have India, Japan, and Australia in many ways. sourcing their technologies, sourcing their strategies to ensure that there is a continuity in the supply between the three countries. And this could be in terms of information, this could be in terms of goods and services, and all of it. So that's necessarily what Resilient Supply Chain Initiative is. And I think it's a very great initiative. I think it holds a lot of potential for the region. And it's also sort of an extension of the Quad initiative that is existing in the Indo-Pacific region. Coming to the space domain, I think there are a lot of very promising investors and startups and companies on space in all three countries. You have Japan, which has a very, very strong foundation, which has laid a very strong foundation on their space industry. You have Australia, which is emerging into, I mean, it has laid its foundations as well, but it's also emerging into the commercial space domain now. India is also on the same plane. Our commercial space domain is just emerging out of its foundation. I mean, the foundations are strengthening now. So you have two emerging space industries, and then you have Japan on one side, which has its experience in the space commercial domain. So I think in this sense, there's a lot to learn from each other. There's a lot to offer each other. And because geographically there is a lot of space that the three countries cover, there's a lot of data sharing that could be done. I think data sharing and situational awareness are something that all countries are striving to strengthen. And recently, I was in an event where we were talking about space situational awareness and also about covering a large geographical region on Earth when it comes to Earth observation and when it comes to uh, SAR data collection and all of it. So I think in that way, these three countries can do a lot. And I think there's a huge loophole in when it comes to studying the oceans using satellites. And I think Australia, Japan, and India are well situated, and the geographically we'll be able to cover a very vast region of the oceans if initiatives are taken on that front. And I feel like the resilient supply chain initiative could be strengthened in the space domain if investments and companies are willing to take that step forward and look at these things. In taking this a little further, we can have companies working with each other from Australia, Japan, and India in tech innovation as well. And I think tech innovation would be something that all three countries are interested in, because that the industry is growing at such a fast pace that today's technology uh, would not be relevant in the next 5 or 10 years to come. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of R&D potential that these three countries can work towards. I feel like these are some things that could be done by India, Australia, and Japan.
Yes, also, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the RSCI initiative is possibly also like one of the key motives of this, and the reason Quad is also possibly
Mm.
supporting it uh,
Yes,
is because the initiative is designed to actually counter the Chinese movements in the Indo-Pacific.
absolutely.
Uh, yeah. So can you little bit extend about that as well?
I think India, Australia, and Japan are very strong regional powers when it comes to the Indo-Pacific area. You have India on one side, Australia and Japan on the other sides, right? So China poses an equal threat to all three countries, equal threat in the oceans, and equal threat again geographically as well, economically as well. So I think this economic threat and regional threat is is what translated into Quad. It's further translating into the regional economic agreements that are coming forth. And I think RSCI is an extension of that. It would really actually counter the Chinese influence in the region. If these three countries manage to work together, they will be able to reduce their dependence on the Chinese economy in many ways, and also strengthen, like, there's a counterbalance that is happening. There's China on one side, there's Australia, India, and Japan on the other side. And if these three countries strengthen their economic capabilities, their economic coordination and cooperation, then you'll have a very strong counterbalance for the Chinese economy in the region and the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, Indian Indo-Pacific Ocean.
So just I would say a little bit extending on the same part,
Yes, sir.
but from possibly an adversary point of view.
Mhm.
So do you believe now governments will need to keep a close eye on regulation and policy reforms to block the adversary movements or the terror or extremist group from acquiring critical technologies like the space?
Um, I feel like adversary groups or like the groups that are a threat uh, to our country are not yet exploring the capabilities or the potential of satellite, having satellite technology with them. But it is a possibility in the future for sure. And I feel like it is very easy to equip them. Now, it's so we know what happened with China and Pakistan, right?
Yes.
Sometime a few years ago, China offered one of their existing satellites to Pakistan, and this is again an observation satellite. So I feel like it's very easy to get a hold of these satellites. So in that sense, in many ways, you'll there is a possibility, but I don't see it happening anytime soon because it's still an
Yeah.
expensive technology to maintain. Despite getting a hold of it, maintaining them would be a little bit challenging because you still need the ground station capabilities. You need access to um, data, collecting data and all of it. So I think that will take a few years, but the potential does exist. And it's a real threat. I think countries are already looking at how to address these problems. I know for a fact that India is looking at it. So I think it is seen as a legit threat.
Yes, I think the reason I asked you this question is because, as far as I know, I had actually read from one of the experts that LTT actually hacked one of the satellites of Intelsat, and where they were actually using it for their own advantage. I'm not sure about the details of the case or the technical aspects of the case, but there have been incidents now. I mean, this is one of those incidents, and uh, where we have actually seen that, uh, like a literal extremist group or an organization which was like tagged under the terrorist groups was utilizing this technology. So I mean, this was back in before, I mean, even 2010 and 2005. So if it was possible in those days, I'm pretty sure like it will be definitely kind of a very high possibility in this
It
day and
is.
age where, yeah.
And
Would
it's
you like to
also, I
add?
mean, yes, sir, definitely. So there is no way to know also. For example, if a state is encouraging these players, for example, any state, I'm not going to name any country, but if a country is um, harboring any form of extremist groups, or there are people who are in power who also have access to extremist groups, for example, and this is again a hypothetical example. I'm just giving an example to explain what I'm trying to say. It's so easy to get hold of information that are from outer space. For example, now today, if in the past, LTTE had to hack a satellite. Today, it's much more easier to hack satellites. It's much more easier to get data from a satellite. And also, for example, today I don't even need to have a satellite of my own. Everything's available in open source. So if I am willing to pay $10, if I'm willing to pay $15, you have open source um, data providers who will give you data, collected data, sometimes processed data for that price. So I feel like it's much more easier to get information, satellite-based information, satellite access to satellites, hacked by hacking or by taking over, for example. And taking over and hacking are not like openly um, disclose. So in case there's been a hacking of a satellite, we don't know much information about how it is, but we know that it has happened in the past. So things like that, it's much more easier now. It's very um, accessible to extremist groups.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you about this because I believe as we go ahead into deep into the future, it will be even impossible, or I would say, close to impossible to track this kind of activities. The way we see in the espionage world, for example, there have been cases where a scientist from some country was working for an agency, for a space agency, for almost 20 years, and he was keeping on passing the information to the adversaries. And it took the country 20 years to actually track down that guy, and
Yeah.
till then the infiltration was done, and
Yes, sir.
it is not repairable at that moment, I would say. And I think this kind of activities will go on, but that's one of the reason I think the governments and the agencies, or I would say the space industry firstly itself,
Mm.
when they say, like the commercialization, they become happy, they need to actually consider this pillars of the security as well, because you don't know the kind of person that is coming in the industry. You don't know, even though his background might sound so well, you don't know at the end of the day what the individual's motives are. And I think that is where the insider risk management aspects also come into the play, which the space industry is not taking seriously. Like I have seen all over in the industry, but people don't know what is insider risk management actually, and that's very sad.
Yeah.
Where such a critical technology is being handled, and people don't know what is the meaning of insider risk management. Anyways, like just I would say kind of a joint question in this only. So do you
Mm.
think this is words like international and space for humanity are misleading at times, given the fact that humanity is already divided even before exploring the uncharted territories in outer space? Because we have already seen the two groups, that is Artemis and International Lunar Research Station of China and Russia. So we are already divided, but still, the people in the commercial space are being so happy about, using the word international. So what are your thought about this?
I think this is it's like a natural progression in any domain. For example, when people were exploring space for the first time, it was okay, humans are going to space. It was it was about US humans or Russian humans going to space, but again, it was a collective thing. And now what has happened is because there are so many countries and everybody is operating based on their own national interests, based on their own national agendas, uh, there is bound to be a divide. And I feel like uh, space for the longest time, I think at least for the last 50 years, has tried very hard to keep the common agenda, like a common resource for humankind, as a global commons alive for about 50 years, like I said. But now what has happened is because everybody is operating based on their national interests, the earth-based or terrestrial-based politics are already reflected in space. And I think that is where your Artemis and the IRLS has come from. If, interestingly, there is still that interest, that there is still that urge to cooperate on both sides, because what Artemis Accords offer and what IRLS offers are not the same. They are in many ways complementing each other. So what happens is there are some countries who are still interested in working on both blocks, but you still see that polarization developing. And I feel like this is something we could probably call it as astropolarity, where you have there is one block very strongly aligning with sticking to the foundational rules given by the Outer Space Treaty. And there is another block that is trying to challenge the foundational principles of Outer Space Treaty and like try to create their own rules, try to create their own regulations, expand the capabilities of the Outer Space Treaty. And interestingly, not just on the moon, you see this happening with the International Space Station as well. uh, International Space Station is about to retire. It's in its final years, but there is no plan to start another space station that would be internationally open to all researchers and all forms of um, interesting scientific um, study. What is happening otherwise is China, Russia, they're all planning their own space stations. China already has placed it in space. Russia has been talking about it. I think sometime last year they were talking about having their own space station. I feel like you will see that also as an emerging trend where countries will begin to operate based on their own national interests, try to have their own capabilities in space because it's much cheaper now. It's well studied, it's tried and tested, so they would want to do it themselves. I feel like that is something that's going to happen. And in many ways, this polarity, the groupings that are emerging are very, very in align with the political differences or the political leanings that countries have on Earth that are operating in space. And I feel like this is a very, very interesting trend to follow, and it would get much more challenging to work together in space in the coming years if this continues.
Definitely, I believe what you said is a very important point about the International Space Station because uh, I think that was a benchmark example for the humanity where two states with no, aligned interest on several things are still cooperating on a scientific level for the greater good of the humanity, I would say. But unfortunately, after the Ukraine-Russia war, that cooperation is no more in place, and it has highly impacted the scientific community. As far as I have seen, at least in Europe, I am not sure about the other parts of the world, but I have seen it getting impacted on a scientific level. The scientific community is not so happy that these things have happened. But so, what is your take on this situation that it has overall impacted the scientific community in the space industry?
So the role of space technology in warfare has actually evolved over time. I think it's very interesting. It's a very interesting trend to observe because the first time it was used for navigational purposes. I feel like so then as the capabilities increased, they were applied much more strongly in warfare. So you have your Gulf War where it was first applied, and then you have the present Ukraine war. And if we compare how it has been applied now, it's changed so remarkably and in such short period of time. Then it makes you wonder how far will this go. And in the case of Russia and Ukraine specifically, we know that as soon as communications were cut off in in Ukraine by Russia, the first thing was done is to provide Starlink communication capabilities. And I think after that, what happened was you have open source commercial players. Again, Starlink is a commercial player. You have open source commercial players who are providing location data of where the troops are, how are their movements, uh, all of those data that was being given to Ukraine, or Ukraine was able to acquire them using commercial capabilities. And then additionally, you have um, satellite data that is being given to them to strategize as well. And I feel like this is something, again, very, very, because of the open source nature of data, it has been used to, it has been applied in the case of Ukraine war. What happened further after 1 year of the war is when Starlink comes forward and says, we did not know that the satellite communication that was given to them, to Ukraine, was applied in the movement of drones. Like was applied in drones. So what Starlink said that we did not know they would use it to weaponize their military. So necessarily, the capabilities of Starlink itself, nobody knew it could be applied so strongly in a military uh, active warfare zone. And then it has been further applied into using them for coordinating their weapon systems and all of that. I feel like this is a very, very good case study to apply and understand how deep can satellite data or satellite capabilities be applied in an active warfare zone. And this is necessarily a country that does not have a very strong presence in outer space. So when you look at a case of, say, India and China, or when you look at a case of, say, US and Russia, now, and then you compare the capabilities of these countries in space, then you will know that it can get 10 times much worse. And I feel like this level of situational awareness, or this level of capability strategic awareness, is something that countries should be addressing, should be planning ahead, and seeing how they will, when you don't know how the capabilities are, because Russia necessarily did not know Ukraine will get so much of satellite support that their systems or their strategy would have to be reoriented to address these emerging responses, right? So if something like that happens, how do you strategize? How do you plan? And this is something that would be a very good case study to look at.
Excellent. I think I was actually not aware about the weaponization of the Starlink in some way. But I believe they were already testing the Starlink. Like Starlink actually had contracts in place with the US government to test their system in the Arctic region, both Starlink and OneWeb. But yeah,
Yes,
I think their primary market was commercial enterprise, anyways. But
yes.
yeah, they didn't go on a full scale military customers at that time. But I think uh, generally, I believe the commercial companies, for them, the war field, no matter whatever the, the illusion that they put up, we have observed this in Afghanistan as well. For the commercial entities, the corporates, the technology used in war is always a kind of an experimentation or a demonstration. They start building up on those, foundations later on. And I
Yes.
think that is also one of the role, like I would like to explore later, possibly in our next follow-up episodes, that how the space technology is used in war, and what are the motives of the corporates, what are the motives of the commercialization, and
Mm.
can this be stopped? Because from the perspective of defense, if I say it,
Yes.
the defense industry has built up on the weapons which were actually used in war. Like, war was a kind of an experimental laboratory for a lot of nations to test their weapons. And Afghanistan, Syria have been like a few of these examples where we have seen the nations, both from both the sides. It might be an adversary from the allied nations as well. Everyone is, trying to test their own thing, and that becomes a foundation for, an R&D in the defense industry. It will be interesting to definitely explore from the space technology perspective as well. By the way, if you'd like to add something to this, please feel free to
Uh,
add.
yes, sir. So just
Yeah.
one more point. When it comes to application of, say, Starlink, who is registered in another country, and his technology is applied in another country's war, then legally it becomes a huge challenge. Whom do you hold liable for the damages, or whom do you hold responsible for this kind of capability? Because now Russia will say, oh, this is an unfair situation. I will say, Russia might say, okay, US is directly engaged in the war because one of their commercial companies are working in the war, or two or three of their companies, because we know there were many commercial satellite guys actively supporting Ukraine's efforts. So legally, this becomes a very big challenge. And I think that also could be explored when we are talking the next time on active warfare, on how you hold somebody accountable, or who is liable to all these things. The liability convention as well. When there's commercial players, how do you place this? And I think it's a very interesting question that we can address.
Definitely. I would say we should actually do some follow-up episodes on this, because I believe there are several questions which have popped up during the discussion, and we can take this up as possibly a benchmark to create follow-up episodes. For sure, actually, we'll see how we can organize this in the coming months. But I guess now we have reached the end of the episode. So,
Yes.
Harini, from your perspective as a researcher who is actively involved in the research of militarization of space. So, what message would you like to give to young researchers like you, as well as the industry experts, regarding the militarization of space, both from awareness point of view and both from getting educated and
Mm.
consuming the narratives, different narratives, as I said during the conversation. So, yeah, please feel free to tell your thoughts on this.
I think the biggest advantage or biggest help would be to engage with people more and more. And when there are workshops, when there are events that are happening, there are networking events that are happening, it would be very useful to talk to more people, engage with more industry players, engage with more academicians, and see and find out what we can learn from them, what they can learn from us. Because when we look at the industry, there's a lot we don't know about what they're investing on or what their ambitions are, and a lot of times they don't know about how what would be best practice for them. And for young researchers who want to study the subject, or who also just want to take up subjects like these, I think it would be very, very good to take up unique subjects like this and try and explore as much as possible. Uh, I'm sure there'll always be people like us who will be there to support their initiatives. We're always available for a conversation, and I feel like topics like these would leave a very huge mark on the subject itself, and this will probably be a starting point to study the subject further. And I feel like these are something that if students are willing to take it up as a challenge, there will be a lot of dialogue that can be generated based on that, and I feel like that would be very good.
Thank you very much, Aruni. Really thankful for such an engaging discussion, because I never had a guest on the podcast who discussed this topic so openly. I had one of the previous guests, but the thing is, like, our topic was not focused on militarization as such; it was on national security. But yeah, she also spoke a lot of things which you have the similar perspective as well on that. So definitely, I think we need to engage in conversation about such topics, and I believe in future we'll definitely create some follow-up episodes on this. So yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for having me. I feel like you're doing a very good job with the podcast. I've seen some of the topics that you've covered before, and I've heard one or two of your podcasts. And this is a very good platform to engage with people, also to create a dialogue on the subject. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Arni. Have a good day.
Thank you.